Welcome to The Cutting Floor, a weekly podcast of West Cannon Baptist Church. Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 26. In your sermon, you mentioned as an application that God has a way of exposing our deceit. Is that always a judgment, or is that for our good?
The scriptures tell us that God disciplines those that he loves. And one of the ways that I think God providentially cares for us is by exposing at times the sin in our lives that, if left unchecked, is going to do irrevocable spiritual harm, right? So I think a classic example of this would be the life of King David. So, he thinks that he's gotten away with his sin with Bathsheba and that he's arranged all of the details in his life and in Bathsheba's life and the taking of her husband Uriah's life. He thinks he's arranged everything so that he's gotten away with his sin and he's gotten everything that he wants. And then the prophet of the Lord comes to David and gives him a parable about this man who steals the prized sheep of his neighbor, and David's incensed about this situation that he thinks is a real story, that he thinks requires justice, and he says, whoever that man is, his life should be forfeit for taking the beloved possession of his neighbors, which of course the prophet is using as a metaphor for David's own sin of taking the wife of one of David's subjects, Uriah. And of course, the prophet then looks at David, and David's there in his righteous anger, and the prophet says, King, you are the man. So David's sin is providentially unveiled by God, who, even though David is content with himself, that he's hidden himself from all of the observing, probing eyes of man, all the time God is fully aware, of course, of what David is doing and brings it out into the light of day and convicts David of what he has done. That, I think, is a testament for us of when God lovingly disciplines his children in such a way that we learn through the consequences of our sin that have been exposed of the spiritual pain and destruction that sin works in our lives. If we're permitted to indulge in sin and experience its passing, fleeting pleasure, but never taste the bitter consequence of sin, then we're quite likely to continue to pursue that thing which is destroying us all the time. And so I think God graciously has a way of revealing to us the folly of where our sin and our deceit leads us. And one of the ways he does that is by exposing our lies.
You also noted the conflict between Isaac and the Canaanites and made the application that it is a challenge for God's people to be in the world but not of the world. Are there other applications we can make from the latter part of the text?
Yeah, so maybe two to think about there. Number one would be that if we, as believing people, as God's people in the world, if we have to be offensive, let's at least be offensive for the right reasons. And by that I mean there's really two episodes in this text that provide cause for Abimelech's anger toward Isaac. The first is a legitimate cause, and the second is an illegitimate. The first is the fact that Isaac comes into the land of the Philistines and he lies to them about his relationship with Rebekah. So he is living in falsehood in a way that is actually putting his neighbors in jeopardy, that one of them could take his wife, sleep with her, and therefore incite God's wrath against them. So that would be a legitimate cause for the Philistines to be angry with Isaac. The second is God's blessing of Isaac. And what we see there is that they are envious of the blessing of God on the life of Isaac, the fact that he's growing so wealthy, so great, so mighty. And that's really what makes them angry. If we're going to have to be offensive as God's people living in a world that hates God, let us not be offensive through our own unrighteous conduct, our own hypocrisy, the way in which we proclaim to be a people who are called out, set apart, righteous, holy, living for God, and yet we live in the same kind of worldly ways like Isaac does, of being deceitful and manipulative, and where our neighbors have legitimate cause for offense at us. Let's not be like that. Let's be offensive for the right reasons, meaning that if the world hated Christ, they'll hate us too, as we look like him, as we proclaim him, as we love him and follow him. That's a valid reason to be offensive to the world. not because of our hypocritical conduct where we say one thing and do another. So I think we can learn from Isaac's story that there are legitimate reasons to be offensive to the world and illegitimate reasons for the Christian or the person of God to be offensive to the world. One other thing that I think we can glean from the latter part of the passage is that there are really two ways that we can respond to the blessing of God on someone else's life. We can either rejoice in what God is doing in their lives, or we can be envious of the fact that God is doing something in them that he doesn't appear to be doing to us. The Philistines have an opportunity when they see Isaac being blessed by God to say, tell us more about who your God is. How can we follow him? And we really value you as a neighbor in the land. We want to be a covenant partner with you. So please stay here, settle down here, make this your home. However we can make you comfortable in this place, tell us, because we know that you're blessed by God. That would be one option. They don't take that option. Instead, they take door number 2, which is they are envious and jealous of what God is doing in Isaac's life, and they say, get away from us. We want nothing to do with you. You're mightier than we are. There's not enough space for both of us. Get out. We have the same propensity in our own lives. And even in the context of the church, we can look around at others who God is blessing. We can see the ways in which he's being so kind to their family or in their job, or any number of different ways, the way that he's uniquely gifted them and given them spiritual gifts or talents and abilities. And we can either rejoice in what God is doing in the lives of others, or we can use that as an opportunity to fan the flames of envy and jealousy or covetousness in our own lives. I think as a warning from this text, we can see that the Philistines made the wrong choice. We ought to instead be a people who rejoice in what God is doing, even when he's doing it in someone else.
What can we learn from the fact that Isaac is so quick to go from obeying and trusting God by not going to Egypt to resorting to deceit in order to save himself?
Well, I think that we can learn from it our own tendency to be what we might consider spiritually flighty. That we can, in one moment, align ourselves with our understanding of who God is and what he's promised to us, and humbly and independent submit to God, and in the next moment be resorting to worldly thinking and worldly means of getting ourselves out of our tight spots or problems. And I think what that really reveals is a tendency that we have at times to be compartmentalized in our thinking, that we've got this area of our life over here that is spiritual, and so we think in spiritual terms and we make decisions through a spiritual framework over here. And then in these other aspects of our lives, it might be our jobs or how we're living among our neighbors, or how we consume entertainment, the kinds of songs we're willing to listen to, or the kinds of movies we're willing to watch, or the kinds of food that we're willing to eat and how much of it, all those sorts of things. We treat those as though those are not spiritual decisions. So we can be spiritual in our thinking and decision making over here and congratulate ourselves that we have a biblical thought process and worldview on those things that we deem to be spiritual choices, while over here we're living through a completely worldly grid and not thinking about how we need to be holistically, biblically informed in the way that we are comporting ourselves, the way that we're making decisions, and the way that we are feeding the desires of our hearts. Isaac, we see in one area, is able to make a spiritual choice, and in another area, he lives like the pagan Philistines. I think we often do the same thing. So we need to submit the entirety of our lives to the lordship of Jesus Christ, and in so doing, live out his word in every place in our lives, not just silo off the spiritual part of our lives and give those to God and act as though the rest of our lives, the normal, mundane kind of cares and experiences, as though those things don't matter to God. No, we are wholly identified with Christ. We are in him. The old things have passed away. The new things have come. That therefore should permeate every aspect of our being.
How do we know that this was not the same Abimelech that Abraham deceived?
When we read back in the accounts of Abraham's life, we encounter Abimelech in Gerar as well. We also encounter Abimelech's military commander, Phicol. So when we come here to Genesis 26, and we encounter Abimelech again, also paired with this military commander Phicol. It's tempting to assume these men are the same. It's the same Abimelech, the same Phicol. I touched on this briefly in the sermon, but I think it's best to understand these identifiers as titles rather than proper names. So Abimelech seems to be the title for the kings of the Philistines, and Phicol would seem to be a term for a military commander, like we might use the term general or something like that. It's not a proper name. It's a title for an occupation. There's a few reasons to think this way. Number one, it's been more than 75 years, probably significantly more than that, since Abraham was in Gerar. So the likelihood that this Abimelech, who at the time that Abraham was there was already a king, so already an adult man, that 75 years have gone on and it's the same Abimelech who is apparently still interested in women, is unlikely. So it's almost certainly at least one generation down in the line of Abimelechs. Secondly, we see this title Abimelech used of the Philistine king all throughout the Old Testament, even many, many generations later. So unless this man Abimelech discovered the fountain of youth and drank from it regularly, we're clearly talking about different men. So for example, we'll read later on in Psalm 34, there's this inscription of David when he changed his behavior before Abimelech, so that Abimelech, drove him out and went away. So it's recounting this time in David's life when he was fleeing from Saul and then realizes that he's wandered into the stronghold of the Philistines after killing Goliath, who was the Philistine champion. So David realizes he's now jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. And the way that he gets out of it is he feigns to be mad and feigns to be crazy. Well, we find the account of that narrative in 1 Samuel 21, and there Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, is referred to as Achish. So Achish is apparently the name of the Philistine king. Abimelech is his title. So if we were to apply that information back here, we find that Isaac is just encountering the next generation of the Philistines, even as the Philistines are encountering the next generation of Abraham's family. And there, as we noted, it's interesting that the Philistines seem to have kept alive an awareness of the fear of God, as reflected in Abimelech's concern over the jeopardy that Isaac's deception has placed over the whole kingdom of Philistines, whereas Abraham doesn't seem to have as faithfully conveyed a warning to his son about the dangers of perpetuating the sister fib lie and the danger of deceiving and relying on deception rather than relying on God.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.